another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LA Football Network. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And for those who are tuning in from ESPN, thank you so much for listening. Great subject that Dan and I want to get into today. Obviously, the Chargers have now broken from minicamp, taking a little break before mandatory training camp takes place next month. But Dan and I wanted to talk about this because this is something that has been on the minds of many people over the past 4 months since Jim Harbaugh's arrival. We have kind of seen flashes and snippets of things that are changing, whether it's how practices are carried out, attitudes of players, overall culture change that Jim Harbaugh is bringing to the Chargers in the early days of the 2024 season. And we're going to delve into this a very interesting way. We'll obviously have a lot of comparisons to previous regimes and how those were different and things in terms of what was said, what was executed, and how that measures up to where Jim Harbaugh currently stands right now. So very excited topic to get into this. Dan and I really wanted to talk about this ad nauseum. But before we get into it, Dan Wolkenstein, how are you, sir?
I'm good. I think you're right, though. There's a lot of people hyped, ourselves included, about the culture shift, quote unquote, and the culture changing for the positive. And I believe everyone is sincere, ourselves included, that we do believe Jim Harbaugh is the right man for the job and is shifting the culture in a positive direction. That being said, this same narrative has been discussed about every coach when they're first hired. And we'll go back and kind of talk about some of the previous ones, being Anthony Lynn and Brandon Staley, the two coaches prior to Jim Harbaugh being brought in. And it's an interesting kind of reflection on snap the line where we thought we were, where coaches looked like they were going to bring this team in previous eras, and where it ultimately ended up falling on its face in both instances previously. So exciting one, an interesting one, and I think an important one for Chargers fans to keep in mind. Again, we always talk about perspective and tempering expectations. As hard as that is for Chargers fans, you got to do it. And we'll look at the past a little bit to do so. But Jake, before we do that, let's pay the bills. Let's talk about our friends.
I want to remind everybody that Bet Online remains your number one source for all your summer sports this season, from MLB, golf, NBA, and NHL playoff stats. All the latest stats, news, and scores available for you to follow for all your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds for just about every sport that is out there. Head on over to the website today. That's betonline.ag. Use the promo code Unleashed. Tell them that Chargers Unleashed sent you. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Now, Chargers fans, brace for this, because this is going to be kind of a in your feelings sort of episode, and one that we may need to check ourselves a bit. And some of us will, this is one of those like bring the receipts moments. And Chargers fans, probably like any fan base who has excitement on the mind with a new head coach, new regime over the years, you see new head coach come in. We talked about Brandon Staley. We talked about Anthony Lynn, Mike McCoy back in the day. I mean, we all saw that press conference that Brandon Staley had. That was epic. And everyone wanted to run through a brick wall for that one. And a lot of the culture being talked about even after that. And you heard buy-in from players and staff and pundits and people covering this team across the gamut. And so you're seeing it again with Jim Harbaugh. And there's a lot of excitement and culture shifting, setting things that are happening now. And so we want to discuss, what is the culture being set by Jim Harbaugh? Is it actually different than we saw in the past? And is it going to be impactful to what matters most in winning football games? Because as much as we want to dismiss the previous coaching from this team over the years, over the last decade or so, they have shifted the culture. But has it impacted their ability to win football games? That's what matters most. So, Jake, I guess to kind of kick it off, where do you see the buy-in from this regime versus previously? And is it any different in terms of the amount of buy-in into the, not what they're buying into, but the amount of buy-in? Has that changed over the years?
I feel like the early days of Jim Harbaugh is already changing. And here's where it's different. I think the biggest aspect of it is how you're already seeing it resonate with the players. Like, you can go back to comments that players made with Brandon Staley. You can go back to comments that were made with Anthony Lynn. You could even go further than that to the comments in the Mike McCoy or the Norv Turner days. This is the difference in terms of what they are executing now, what they're saying now, that's different than we've ever seen before. And I love that we brought this up because Michael Lombardi was on Pat McAfee's show, and he was actually asked, how is this culture different than the rest of the previous regimes that have come in there? And I love the way that Michael Lombardi talked about this, because obviously Jim Harbaugh, with his players, he's going to make him mentally tough. He's going to make him physically tough. That's old news at that point. That's the way that Jim Harbaugh has lived in Michigan and San Francisco during his coaching times there. But here's the difference that Michael Lombardi said. He said, it's not about just being the most talented team. It's about being the most connected team. And that is what he said that Jim Harbaugh is going to install in terms of the mentality with this group. How many years have we been talking about it where on paper, the Chargers have one of the most talented rosters in the NFL? And year after year after year, it just seemed like they were underperforming. This is going to be the difference. These little attentions to detail that we're already seeing in the early days of OTAs, getting you to prepare in June, in July, for the dog days that you're going to have in October, November, that are going to make the difference between making the playoffs and sitting on the couch. So I love this whole mentality and this buy-in that you're seeing from both coach and players to, it doesn't matter the individual talent that we have at multiple positions. If we can play like a connected team, that will beat anything else that is out there on the field. And that's dangerous for opposing teams.
But I think we have to be specific here because, again, and this is like one of those check the receipts moments where we go back to, and I went back and kind of did some homework on this beforehand, where I see quotes from the likes of Desmond King talking about Anthony Lynn and Melvin Ingram and folks talking about the Anthony Lynn phase and how connected that team was. And it was a brotherhood and the locker room was so bought into everything. That's connected, but are we talking about connecting the locker room or are we talking about connected on the field?
It's connecting on the field because you and I had talked about this, felt like for the past 2 years as it relates to whether it was Brandon Staley and Joe Lombardi or Brandon Staley and Kellen Moore, that their ability to adapt on the week-to-week basis just could never end up happening. It just was not sinking in. And we felt that there was a disconnect in that locker room between player and coach. And whatever the message may have been, because you're absolutely right, these are some of the same rhetorics that we have heard from players at this point of the season. But whatever message was sent in the early days of training camp got lost during the regular season, and the execution wasn't there.
So, okay, let's go back. Anthony Lynn, Brandon Staley, then Jim Harbaugh. Okay, so I'm pulling up some slides here to kind of help with this. Anthony Lynn, culture revisit. This was from Sam Fortier from The Athletic. This is 2019. Quote, in 2 years, the Chargers added grit, became a reflection of unflappable head coach Anthony Lynn. We all remember, at least those who were fans at the time or covering the team then, there were lots of things that Anthony Lynn set from a culture perspective that were great. He did bring that grit and that determination and I think the maturity and the accountability from teams. And you saw him kind of attempt to help this team impose their will on other teams. And you saw kind of that tough physicality come out at times. Again, culture changing, culture shifting, right? But then there were things that we all saw that were terrible. We saw the clock management, the timeout, some of the in-game adjust, like all of that stuff kind of fell flat in its face. But there were culture shifts when Anthony Lynn was brought in that people praised. But did it result in winning football games? I would say no. If you look at the history, for the most part, there were glimpses, there were times, but it didn't work out. That culture shift that they brought in wasn't enough to propel this team to a championship football team.
And for context, that quote was taken in February of 2019. That was just following the Chargers' 12-4 season that they had just put up under Anthony Lynn in 2018, when we feel like that was the last time that they had a reliable defense, that they actually had a playoff win, that you actually felt that there was a semblance that they may be able to make a playoff run. This was just a few months after that season, which for Anthony Lynn, it was great. And what he was able to do with the Chargers that season was also impressive. But as Dan mentioned, what followed in the seasons after that? Situational football. Message not being felt, not being translated, not being able to build on the success that you had previously. You can also probably factor into the personnel aspect in terms of what they wanted to execute was also not the best.
And roster building, I think,
Correct.
was a part of that. And again, head coach takes the fall all the time, especially with a new GM, but, didn't help. So there were things that people praised about Anthony Lynn as soon as he was brought in. The hype was real. Then he has some success. Everyone's praising his ability to bring this team to the promised land. Falls on its face. Then, about switch, they bring in Brandon Staley. We all remember the press conference. And that team's first year, if you remember, they did pretty good. They went all the way up to week 18. Everyone talks about the culture shifting, myself included. There was a lot of Brandon Staley fans and stands because of what he was bringing from the Rams, what he was talking about in his press conferences, what you saw in that first season. We talk about the aggressiveness, right? We talk about this team establishing this tough and rugged mentality and to go for and relying on your playmakers and putting on the shoulder of Justin Herbert. And you have this new defense, right? Everyone's bought in. And again, we all want to talk about how bad of a coach he was, and everybody, there's a reason why Jim Harbaugh is a head coach. We all get that. But if we go back and look at some of the players who were talking about Brandon Staley and the culture that Brandon Staley was building, this is Keenan Allen. Quote, "I thought it was good. I thought the culture has changed." This was right after the week 18 loss to the Raiders, by the way, that first year of Brandon Staley's head coaching tenure. "I thought the culture has changed. I think we're transitioning into a winning organization. Head coach Brandon Staley is building a lot of confidence in the culture and the coaching staff. We just have to be ready and do better next year." That's Keenan Allen. Justin Herbert talked about it. Joey Bosa talked about it. Justin Jones was talking about it. There's a bunch of guys that were talking about this culture that Brandon Staley's building into a championship organization. But that ended up not coming to fruition, and it fell flat in his face. We've talked about some of the coaching and the verbiage and the things that he was saying maybe started to kind of fall on deaf ears. We saw a lot of the miscommunication or the lack of success, to put it bluntly, from this defense in that scheme, which we thought he was kind of hanging his hat on. Offense goes from Mike Lombardi to Joe Lombardi to Kellen Moore. The offense never really turned into what we thought it was going to be. And it kind of seemed like, I don't want to say that Brandon Staley was in over his head, which maybe he was, but it felt like there was not enough support around him from experienced individuals on that staff that he would either bring in and or listen to and rely on to do their job well and let him coach from the top. It seemed like he was trying to do everything, and it kind of all just kind of melted.
I think when you look at
it, people were bought into the culture.
I think when you look at Brandon Staley's coaching tenure, because you laid it out perfectly then, we remember when we were listening to those press conferences, how different that sounded as opposed to previous coaching regimes that we had seen from the Chargers in recent years. I think Brandon Staley is the physical embodiment of the Mike Tyson quote, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face." Because to me, that's exactly what happened. I think that Brandon Staley, in terms of what he wanted to do with this team, was actually a good plan. But when it came down to executing it and adapting to the things that were changing,
that's a good point.
Those were his downfalls, and he was not able to do that. And I love the fact in terms that you brought up the personnel around him, especially after that Jacksonville loss in the playoffs. I think from getting to that point where he may have been over his head, I think that may have been a moment to have a slice of humble pie and to say, look, I know I'm a defensive-minded head coach, and I'm still in charge of calling all the plays here for the past 3 years. Maybe it's time that I bring in some different type of coaching experience to help me out as a first-time head coach. You know, one of the benefits that Anthony Lynn had is that he had Gus Bradley as his defensive coordinator, which at that point in time, he was a seasoned veteran. He knew what he was doing from a defensive standpoint. He knew how to utilize Derwin James properly. With Brandon, when he came over from the Los Angeles Rams, we all thought that there was going to be this mass exodus, that there were going to be coaches that would follow him. And truth be told, from that same staff, that didn't end up happening. We all heard the stories that there were rumblings that there were going to take place in terms of following Brandon Staley, but it never took place. And even in the years following, in terms of your coaches, there wasn't too many experienced ones, especially on the defensive side, that you brought in to assist them. And I think those were the issues with Brandon Staley. I think he had a plan and it looked good on paper, but when it came to executing that on Sundays, it fell flat on its face and he just couldn't adapt to it.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate too, right? Like the defense statistically, there are some statistics what they were doing that they did really well, but overall, 1 year run defense is atrocious. We talk about explosive plays that apparently this defense was designed to not allow, and it was just happening every week. And there was a disconnect from the high up coaching staff and the head coach down to executing as players. It didn't work out. Defense looked lost many times. The offense was not what it should have been, and people were not really put in positions to succeed oftentimes, right? You look at like the running game was non-existent. We look at the tight end group, what happened? We look at Justin Herbert getting crushed all the time and injured because of it. Look at that protection issues. We look at how Quentin Johnston was used last year. Everyone talks about he was not put in a position to succeed, let alone the drops. We get that, but can we give the guy some help? There's a bunch of things that went wrong that as a head coach, that's your job. You got to see a problem, fix a problem, and not just kind of keep trying to push perfection, and then one guy slips up and the whole thing unravels. That's Brandon Staley, right? Culture was believed in. People bought in, and then at the end of the day, it all kind of fell through. So then the question then becomes, now with Jim Harbaugh, what's different? Why should we believe that this culture that is bought in by players is going to work?
I mean, take your pick. This is a guy that has seen success every single place that he has been throughout his coaching career. You look at his time during San Francisco, people can say whatever they want in terms of him not winning a Super Bowl, but he turned that organization around. He was essentially Kyle Shanahan before Kyle Shanahan in terms of what Kyle Shanahan has done with that franchise. Then you see what he did with Michigan. It's like, oh, well, it took him so long to win a championship. It doesn't matter. It turned the organization around. I get it. Everything's measured these days in terms of the rings that you have on your finger. But with this Chargers team.
But real quick, why does, so all that stuff's in the past, right? What is he doing now that is affecting this team's ability to win?
That's just what I was going to say. The one thing that the Chargers have lacked is that X factor in coaching, and it's the attention to detail. Also, on top of that, he's got guys that followed him that he's very familiar with from a coaching standpoint. So not just the players that buy into the message that he sent, but he's got a number of coaches that also do as well. So if he's not able to be right in front of every single player that's out there, obviously he's going to be spending most of his time with Justin Herbert. But your coaches like Jesse Minter, Clinkscale, Greg Roman, all of those guys are bought in on the message of as far as what needs to be executed, and they're going to translate that message. How is it being affected already? Maybe look at Khalil Mack's quote, because Khalil Mack doesn't mince words. He's very honest when he speaks. And when he says a quote to say, I feel that Jim is coaching this team the way it needed to be coached, that's a big statement without saying many words. But that's something that the Chargers have lacked for a very, very long time. One of the things that also resonated with me, Dan, Jim Harbaugh was talking about when during this whole mini camp OTA period, he says, I'm ending practice 30 minutes early, or I'm ending a weight session 30 minutes early, and the guys don't stop. You're now getting these players to be self-reliant on what it takes to get to that next level. And when you do that, when you don't need a coach or somebody else telling you what to do, when you just have the mindset to do it already, that's where you're seeing the message bought in. And if this is being bought in June, this is going to pay big dividends by the time that we get to the end of November.
Yeah, and there's kind of a split between kind of the macro effects and the micros, right? Macro, you look at kind of the brain trust he's brought in that we've talked about, where you have a lot of folks in the kitchen making sure that people aren't doing stupid things, making sure that they're implementing what will work and be successful with proven successful coaches on his staff, right? That's the macro. He's been a successful coach everywhere he's been. He understands meaningful football, right? He understands what it takes to win in terms of physicality, in terms of establishing a run game, protecting the quarterback, establishing a dominant offensive and defensive line. Those are all the macro things, right? You look at the micros of what Jim Harbaugh is pushing this team to do and the staff he brings in to do it, right? It's not just Jim Harbaugh, right? For those of you on ESPN Radio, thank you guys so much for tuning in. This has been an enlightening episode. To find a full one on LAC_Unleashed on YouTube and anywhere you find your podcast. It's not just Jim Harbaugh. He talks about, leaning on experts to do what they do best and relying on them for answers. You bring in a Ben Herbert to fix kind of the strength and conditioning and to kind of help with those attention to detail type things with the plates. You've all heard about that. He brings in Greg Roman, who is an expert at fixing and establishing dominant run games. He brings in multiple people on this staff who are experts at what they do. Specifically, look at Navarro Bowman doing it as a coach. Look at Nick Hardwick doing it as a coach, as a player, and now as a coach. All of the guys they brought in to focus on specifics, right? They're focusing on a Jesse Minter, for example. It's not necessarily the scheme that's important, which obviously is important. There's a lot of similarities between his scheme and Brandon Staley's, but it's the teaching of it and applying it that matters. You look at kind of the confidence that this team has because of the confidence and success of Jim Harbaugh, right? Like there's that illusion, the aura of Jim Harbaugh that will lead them to the promised land. I've done it before. I'll do it again. The buy-in is there. The buy-in's real, but the buy-in is always there. And every new coach. But it's, are you buying into the things that matter? And that seems like the difference of this team. Attention to detail has plagued this team across the last 3-4 coaching schemes, right? Playing meaningful football, finishing games. All of that stuff is what this team has been plagued by, right? I think sometimes Brandon Staley was too aggressive and used analytics to a fault. First year, everybody praised him, right? 4th and Staley, we all loved it. And then afterwards, everybody's kind of saying, oh, too much. I think Jim Harbaugh understands the landscape and brought in folks to succeed. So I just want to be, I think that the lesson here, right, is what this team should focus on and what parts of the culture actually matter in terms of winning football games. Jake, any other like big rocks of why Jim Harbaugh's culture will work over the previous ones?
Again, I just think you go back to that attention to detail, Dan. Hell, even the little things that we have seen, and we've talked about this on the show previously, as far as just putting yourself into in-game uniform, having these different drills that are helping build up anticipation between wide receiver and quarterback. Again, you look at this staff, the way that it's been built out, that everybody's bought into the same message. You could probably say that the next person that would carry Jim Harbaugh's message as well as anybody would probably be Ben Herbert in terms of how he talks and what he does to motivate guys and how calculated he is in the little things. So we said it. When was the last time that we ever heard a strength and conditioning coach take the podium for a press conference? That was seemingly unheard of. You just don't hear things like that. But when you have someone as powerful as a message of Ben Herbert and what a priority it was for Jim Harbaugh to take him with him from Michigan when he came to the Chargers, that's saying something. So when you've now built this foundation of your coaches that are based off of this message and this game plan and what you want to execute, the rest is going to come from that. And I hearken back to that quote from Michael Lombardi in terms of it's not about from the standpoint of who has the most talented team. The Chargers have had that. We've said that for years. On paper, we've said that phrase for years and constantly see it being underdelivered. How is it that these other teams are able to beat them when they look like they can have so much talent to beat anybody? It's when you have teams that are bought into a better message and they play better collective football. Chargers need to get to that and let go of individual accomplishments and play like a team.
You know, when Jim Harbaugh was hired, we quickly pointed out that it's not just about Jim Harbaugh. It's kind of about that army that he's bringing with him, right? And you look at the coaching staff that came with or came to either one, Jim Harbaugh. You look at a Joe Hortiz and the differences that people are seeing, but Joe Hortiz ain't coming here without Jim Harbaugh, right? We hear all the coaching staff talk about Jesse Minter's defense and how easily it is to learn the system and how well they are at coaching it. It's complex, but you know, the idea of stacking things on top of each other and emphasis on being versatile and the versatility within each of the different position groups and the collaboration between the different position groups and no loss in translation across all of that brought in by Jim Harbaugh, right? Everyone talked about, we've heard Derwin James, Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Justin Hurst, everybody's talked about the difference that Jim Harbaugh brings to this team. And that's that CEO mentality where he sets the standard and he is effectively having that trickle down to the players. That's what matters. And we haven't seen or heard that stuff come from this team since I can remember. And so everyone talks about Jim Harbaugh's culture being bought into, right? But other cultures have been bought into as well. But the difference here is what type of culture is being bought into. So, you know, if you're hearing people say, oh, you know, people weren't buying into the culture before in previous regimes, not true. Like everybody was, but was it the most effective culture to win football games? And did it actually work? That, I think, is why people are so excited about Jim Harbaugh, because obviously there's the previous history of success. But the things that we're seeing him harp on and the staff harp on with this new team, right? Attention to detail, physicality, improving the run game, being a balanced offense, having the defense actually be effective, bringing in a defensive coach that can focus on just being a defensive coach, right? Look at what Joe Hortiz has brought in on the offseason, some of the prove-it deals, the compensatory formula, all of that jazz, kind of the bigger picture things that help franchises build upon itself year over year, developing the underbelly of the roster. All of these things are brought in because of Jim Harbaugh's culture and attention to detail and ability to build successful organizations. That's the culture. And that's a culture that works. That's what people are excited about. So let's be clear and specific here. So a fun one, and I think one that is important to understand as you go through. And we hope that this will prove dividends, right? We hope that those things that he's harping upon will bring success. It has worked before. Will it work now? That's what everybody is banking on. So in Jim Harbaugh, we all trust. Make no mistake about it. But what has people excited is the type of culture that people are buying into. Jake, anything else before we get out of here?
This was a fun one, Dan. It was interesting when you go back to compare to the previous regimes. And yes, to that argument to say, like, yes, players are going to buy into what coaches say, and whether that was North Turner, Mike McCoy, Anthony Lynn, Brandon Staley, like, yes, I'm sure they all came in with a plan. But how is it translated to what happens on the field? And that's been the difference from the Chargers. I think that's where they've relied too much on talent over what they can collectively do as a team.
On top end talent.
Yes. Jim Harbaugh, he believes the team can win overall. but it's instilling that mentality in every single person. Even if we're talking about third string players, he wants that message to resonate with everyone. And I think that's the difference between winning footballs and sitting on the couch during playoff time.
Yeah. So the culture is shifting, clearly. But it's the type of culture that is shifting that we believe will bring in a winning organization for this franchise. So, all right, well, that's going to do it for Jake Hefner. I'm Dan Wolkenstein, Chargers Unleashed, LA Football Network. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.